do some intros here. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. As many of you know, my name is Jenny Koch, and I'm the project manager for Cville Plans Together. I'm a consultant with RHI, or Roadside, in Harwell. Before we get started, I want to know we will be recording, or we are recording, this presentation. We'll be posting it on the website, cvilleplans-together.com. We usually aim to get it up within about 24 hours. It'll also be linked to our YouTube page. So if you search for cvilleplans-together.com, hopefully you can find that. Let's see here. Before I jump into anything, I want to just do some brief introductions. I've already introduced myself. We also have from the consultant team, Latoya Thomas on with us today, Lee Einsweiler, who just joined from Code Studio. And then I want to give a very special introduction to Ron Sessoms, who some of you have met and some of you have not. Ron is with RHI. He's an urban designer and urban planner. He was with RHI for a while and sort of went away briefly, and then now he's back with us and has some experience with some of our previous projects in Charlottesville. So he will be leading us through the land use plan process. So you'll hear quite a bit more from him later in this meeting, but just wanted to make sure everyone met Ron. But with that, Ron, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and pull up the agenda, that would be great. Perfect. So as I noted, we've got a 2-hour meeting and lots to cover. So we're happy to make clarifications and have discussion throughout, but we will try to sort of stop maybe at the end of each section to have a broader discussion. And I want to note we do have several non-steering committee members in sort of watching the meeting tonight, and we do look forward to hearing your comments and questions toward the end of the meeting. We'll make sure the chat function is available, and we can also bring you off of mute to share your questions and comments. But tonight, as you can see, we will start the meeting with some project updates, recognizing we haven't seen you since November, many of you. And then the bulk of our time will be spent talking about the future land use framework, which is a really key component of the comprehensive plan. So Ron, if you want to go to the next slide, and then I guess the next one after that, I can give a brief, I'll do as good as I can being brief with a project update here. One thing to note, we've had several changes to the membership of the steering committee since November. So I want to make sure we shout out to these folks. One is Christine Jacobs has replaced Chip Boyles as the representative for the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, or TJPDC. As you probably know, Chip Boyles is now the city manager, so he's not on our steering committee, but will certainly be involved in this effort as it moves forward. So welcome, Christine. Another new member is Jeanette Avi-Nader, and please correct me if you would like to correct the pronunciation. Jeanette has replaced Chantel Bingham as the representative for Cultivate Charlottesville, so welcome, Jeanette. And then the third change since November is that Annie Stoop is no longer on the steering committee representing CLIC, but we're glad to have Emily Dreyfus as well as others who are connected to that group still participating. So just walking back a little bit, after we met in November, as you know, we were in that time getting community input on the affordable housing plan, as well as some preliminary comprehensive plan updates. So in December, we started summarizing that feedback from those engagement activities. And in January, we shared a summary online, and I believe we sent it out to you all via email sort of mid-January. We got a lot of great feedback. Some of it influenced the affordable housing plan. Some of it influenced the comprehensive plan. Some of it sort of across the board. But taking into account all the feedback we received from the community, as well as the Planning Commission and Council, we then worked to revise the affordable housing plan. We met with Planning Commission and Council to discuss that. I think I sent you a few emails about that, so I won't get into too much detail, but we're very happy to say that last Monday, Council voted to endorse the affordable housing plan. And we will talk more about that on the next slide. Certainly not something to gloss over with that. It's a big step. But before we get to that, just some other brief updates. We are also sort of finalizing the revisions to the guiding principles and vision statements based on the input we received from the community and others, and late last year. And we've also been, since we met last, working on the draft land use plan, which is obviously what we'll be talking about more today. Let's see, if you go to the next slide, please, Ron. So one note about the affordable housing plan, I wanted to clarify, Council voted to endorse this plan last Monday, a week from today. And per their final decision, they made an adjustment on the target funding allocation. They voted to endorse the plan with the change to shift funding slightly to target more on the lower sort of income level served end of the spectrum. So previously, this target allocation percentage had 40% allocated for up to 30% AMI, 40% funding allocated for up to 60% AMI, and then 20% for the highest sort of AMIs up to 80% AMI. And then the council voted to instead shift the funding a bit, as you can see here, to make 50% or half of the target funding allocation of $10 million a year, to target that toward those incomes up to 30% of the area median income. So I just wanted to point that out. That is in the final plan that has been now shared on the website. So we've shared that on the website. I'm happy to link you to that if you can't find it, but I want to really reiterate, we really appreciate all your sort of partnership in reviewing, starting with the goals of this plan and working toward recommendations, starting from early 2020. So we look forward to continuing to work with you all on how we incorporate the affordable housing plan into the comprehensive plan, but then also working with you all on the other pieces of the comprehensive plan that really work to address the needs that have been identified. And to that point, Ron, if you go to the next slide, we do have an updated schedule. It was updated in early February. And now that the housing plan has been endorsed by council, we're moving forward with sort of incorporating those strategies both in the text of the plan as well as in this land use discussion that we'll be having today. We're also looking at other revisions needed to chapter goals and strategies or actions to address issues both related to housing as well as other topics in the city, from transportation to environment and climate, etc. So we're working on developing a land use map and these text edits to the chapters, which we hope to share with the community in April. And then we're working toward sort of June as a time to have a full plan together, which is a bit, it shifts a little bit out from the original schedule due to various factors, but we think it's still, June is realistic. So with that being said, before we jump to land use, I want to open up, are there any questions about any of that I went over fairly quickly? All right. Hearing none. Ron, if you want to go to the next slide, that'd be great. So I will give a really brief introduction to the topic of land use that we'll be discussing today, and then I'll pass it off to Ron. I will get some water before I do that. I want to note, if any of you sat in on the Planning Commission work session that we had on February 23rd, whether you are a planning commissioner or not, you'll find that a lot of this is really similar material. And we sort of did that on purpose because we wanted to get comments from the Planning Commission and then see how you all might feel about the same, planning, the framework structure that we identified. But if you go to the next slide, Ron, just as sort of an intro to this topic, we've been talking a lot about housing, and housing is a key piece of land use, but land use is more broad than just looking at housing. So we have a chapter in the comprehensive plan that we're now calling land use, urban form, and historic preservation. And I'm sorry, it says urban design on there, but we are calling it urban form. This chapter will include recommendations and strategies related to land use, as well as a future land use map, which will describe the overall vision for how the city should develop. As you know, a future step of the Cville Plans Together effort is to revise the zoning ordinance. And we want to be clear before we get started too far about how the future land use map is related to, but separate from zoning. So to that end, a few points. The future land use map is a tool to describe the comprehensive plan's long-term vision for the location and character of development in the city. It's meant to guide, but it's not a requirement for development, but it can be used when evaluating development proposals, though it's not legally mandatory to do so. So basically, if for example, the Planning Commission is reviewing a proposal, they can refer back to the comprehensive plan to see if it's in line with those goals in the plan. It's important to note the comprehensive plan future land use map is not in and of itself zoning. It's, unlike the future land use map, zoning presents requirements that are mandatory unless waived. So by changing the land use map in the comprehensive plan, we're not automatically changing zoning. But again, as a part of the Cville Plans Together process, our next step after the comprehensive plan is looking at the zoning ordinance and the, rewriting the zoning ordinance to make sure it's in line with the comprehensive plan as well as other needed revisions. Ron, if you go to the next slide, one more thing to note is, as you may recall, when we reviewed those vision statements in November and December, these vision statements sort of open up each of the chapters in the plan. And so the chapter related to the future land use map is this, again, this land use, urban form, and historic preservation chapter. And so I've pulled in the vision statement here. And I wanted just to keep in mind that this is the text that will introduce the land use plan. So we'll be keeping these sort of vision statement pieces in mind throughout the development of the land use plan. So we want to look at ways to address inequities, increase the supply and affordability of housing, improve and protect the health of the natural environment, support an efficient transportation network with a variety of options for travel, and increase commercial vitality throughout the city. So with all of that being said, keep all of that in mind in terms of the sort of role of the land use framework that we're going to talk about today. Ron, I will pass it off to you to get into some more detail.
Hey, thank you, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. As we look to developing the future land use plan, it is important to take a step back and look at historical precedent, the historical way that the city has grown and changed over time. The city has had a storied past. Its early development lied primarily as a result of the establishment of UVA and the construction of the Virginia Central Railroad, which provided opportunities for growth for the city. By 1888, the city of Charlottesville was incorporated as a town, and the city grew from its original 781 acres. So in those beginning times, pre-Civil War, the city of Charlottesville slowly grew. And then post-Civil War, like other communities throughout the United States, there was a series of initiatives that weren't so friendly to the city's African-American residents. In the early or late 1890s, there were a series of city ordinances that created racial covenants that restricted where African-American residents could live in the city. And it's important to understand this history because it really, to this day, even though that was a really long time ago when these restrictions were in place and they no longer exist, I will note that it has influenced the development patterns of the city, of where people live and where access and opportunities lie, even to this day. In 1912, there were other ordinances that further ensured the segregation of races within the city. And then by 1929, that was even more formalized through the first zoning code that was initiated in the city And that was the first major citywide master planning effort that was undertaken in the city. And I will reiterate that these racial covenants from the 1890s and early 1900s no longer exist in the city today. But again, we just want to make sure that we recognize that as important to the history of the development of the city. In the mid 1900s, the city continued to grow, and by 1956, the city began to develop its first comprehensive plan. And that comprehensive plan was very important because it called for the elimination of slums, traffic congestion, and inadequate parking in the city. So what that meant was some underserved communities like Vinegar Hill was lost. And these were important African-American communities that lie in and around the downtown area, and they were lost and raised to make way for more development of the city's downtown district. And this is something that's very significant to the history of Charlottesville, because this was something that was very contentious. And something that really changed where particularly the African-American residents in the city lived and where they had opportunities to live, and further restricting where the city's African-American residents had opportunities for housing with red line areas. You can see from this map, from the Mapping Charlottesville project, you can see parcels in red. And this mapping exercise is beginning to identify those historic properties that were known as red line properties that had restricted covenants that did not allow for African-American residents to live in these neighborhoods. So you begin to see they cropped up in and around the downtown area. And as this mapping exercise continues, you will see kind of a belt of red line properties around the downtown district, which really served to hold that African-American population in place. So that's something that was quite different, that was done, quite interesting, that was done at that time, that shaped the demographic, spatial development of the city. Moving into after the 1970s, that period of urban renewal, 1991, the city redid its zoning map. And of course included some of the outlying annexed areas as part of that effort. And then by 2008, the current zoning code was adopted. And by 2013, the comprehensive plan, as we know it today, was adopted. And, of course, this process will lead to an update of that 2013 comprehensive plan. So you can see, and these aren't all the events that had happened regarding planning and urban design in the city, but these are some of the high points and ones that we want to recognize and specifically call out as significant events that surely shaped how the city has developed to date. With that, before I move on to the next section, did anyone have any questions or input about the historical transformation of the city over time, or any thoughts regarding that aspect of the future land use plan thinking? If not,
I'll just chime in. I mean, I'm going to say what I think a lot of folks are thinking, which is this is among many great crimes related to housing and race in Charlottesville. This is something that should be addressed in a community-based plan to make a land use policy. There's a lot of problems in how we got to this spot, and there's a lot of sort of one-for-one comparisons you can make neighborhood by neighborhood when you compare the current zoning to the racial covenants. And I think it's our duty as a community to come up with a way to attempt to right that wrong as best we can.
Mm-hmm.
Able to hear me?
Yes.
A little quiet.
Sorry, it wasn't working before. I think the current zoning ordinance was adopted in 2003. You might want to
Okay, we can check that date
double check
with
that.
Missy and Alex. Yeah.
There's probably some sort of update in '08, but
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll check that date. Any other thoughts, or we can move on to the next section, and we can always come back and tie it all together with the next pieces of the presentation. So that brings us to Charlottesville today. And as we think of Charlottesville, we can't think of it in a bubble. It lies within the region. Most specifically, it lies within Albemarle County. There has been joint planning efforts between the city and the county. What you see here is a future land use map for the urban ring area around the perimeter of Charlottesville. And you can see here from the colors, purple being mixed use, yellow being residential, blue being university and office uses, and green being open spaces and park areas. You can see there's quite a bit of development area planned around the periphery of the city. The city has 50,000 residents. It's only 10 square miles. So it's important to not only look to our borders for opportunities for growth, but we also need to pair that with the areas around the city to really maximize opportunities, particularly for housing. You know, there's a lot of residential areas planned around the city to supplement, of course, what we will be adding for the future land use map as well. Now, we'll point out there are areas of more intense development planned around the city's periphery, particularly along the US 29 corridor, which stretches from the city's boundary north, which was part of the Places 29 corridor master planning area. And then Pantops is another area of more intense development on the city's eastern edge. That gives a little bit more opportunity for perimeter development around the city. Zooming into Charlottesville, Charlottesville has a lot. It is a major regional hub for amenities, including areas to shop. The city's civic amenities, particularly located in downtown, which makes, you know, Charlottesville a hub of activity. And when looking at this map, we began to map some of the major resource areas, such as shopping amenities, civic and cultural resources, parks and open spaces, that you can begin to see where these dots lie, that there is a pattern to where amenities are located in the city. The US 29 corridor is one hub of activities focused around retail and commercial development. Then we have downtown, which also, of course, because of the downtown mall, is a major shopping destination with many civic uses. And Charlottesville is the county seat of Albemarle County, so there's a lot of government and city offices located downtown. And those are two kind of established hubs for the city. And then back to that Pantops area to the east side of the city, the new hospital out on that end of the city is really beginning to create a new focal point, a third focal point of development on the city's east side. So we thought that was something that will be important as we think about the land uses within the city boundary and how some of these areas of activities not only occur in the city, but extend out into the county.
Hey, Ron, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
If you are trying to point out the hospital, I think it's actually near that Interstate 64.
Yep, it's right here. Here's Interstate 64 right there.
Yeah, I think it's just north of the river there, but I didn't know if you were trying to point out something else with that circle or if it was supposed to be over. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm looking at the wrong place. Is that?
Yeah, so this is the Martha Jefferson Hospital here. And this is 250 that comes down. I can see the building here in the parking lot.
Sorry, I was looking at the wrong place.
Oh, no worries.
Thank you.
But yeah, that's it. You can see the hospital in the parking lot right there.
But Ashley pointing that out points to another thing, which is that the Pantops that opportunity area, like the US 29 opportunity area, it's a city-county opportunity. It's not something that's only in the county right across the river from the city. There's like big, there's sections of the city that are a part of that, shall we say, conversation as well.
Yep. And you'll see that in the framework diagram when we're starting to make that connection from some of these areas back to the city. So I think that's something that's I'm glad that you brought up as an opportunity. Definitely.
Is the area south of that, is that like the Broadway area and going down to the woolen mills?
Yeah, so
I-64.
woolen
so that might
mills,
be like
yeah.
another little circle that we put in.
As another focal area. Yeah, we can definitely pull in that woolen mill area that's right at the city border. It's right in this area.
Hey, Ron, do you happen to know what the pink dots on this map are? I think they're not. Or is that the hot pink dot down by the down by West Main, for example?
Cville. In the key, they're listed as hospital.
No,
The
I think
light
there's a
pink,
different. The
then
light
there's a
pink
hot
is
pink.
hospital, but we'll make sure we
Put
address that. I just had
everything
a
that's in
question
the
about
legend.
that.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay, moving on. And employment is just like any other city. Employment is very important, and it's important to understand where the city's employment hubs are located throughout the city. And of course, in this map, this is US Census Bureau information. You can see downtown is a major hub of employment. And then you see that other end of the knuckle, which is UVA, to the city's west side. So the more intense the purple, the more intensive the employment center areas we have. So downtown UVA being the core. And then the US 29 corridor, again, is a major employment area with all of the commercial uses that's located along that corridor. Zooming out even further, we provided an inset map where you can see what's going on around the periphery of the city. That US 29 employment area extends north from the city. There's a cluster of high employment around the elementary, intermediate, and high school. So that dark purple there, interesting enough, makes a very intense employment bubble there. And then you have the Martha Jefferson Hospital, which is on the east side of the city. And we pointed that out on the last slide of that being a major employment area for the city as well. The city has planning areas. These are not specific neighborhoods, but these are areas designated by the city for planning and coordination. And you can see there are many neighborhood planning districts within the city. There are 20, and each of them are very different in size, context, land uses, history, and demographics. So that's something that we want to recognize, the diversity of the city. The city has a diverse residential character. This is a map that Commissioner Rory Stolzenberg prepared, and we've allowed us to use, which is excellent. But you can see here all of the different residential types that are within the city of Charlottesville. And you can see it's like a colorful pattern of different housing types. And even areas that you traditionally think of as traditional single-family residential neighborhoods, they do include other uses such as duplexes and condos and quadruplexes. So this map really begins to show us how diverse Charlottesville neighborhoods are, and they're not as static as one would think by just driving around many of these city streets. So we thought that was something that was very interesting and really helps us when we think about the future land use of these residential neighborhoods. And when we talk about residential character, it generally lies on a spectrum from lower density housing, which would include more of your single family houses, all the way up to higher density developments like your mid-rise apartments that are multi-story, urban in nature. And then we have what we call the missing middle, the townhouses, the duplexes, the triplexes, and quadruplexes, which are typically more affordable to a wide range of residents. So Charlottesville has a lot of single family. Charlottesville has some apartments, but we really are missing that missing middle housing that could provide opportunities for a greater range of opportunities for residents to live that are more affordable than some of the more single family home typologies. Charlottesville is very diverse. This map is showing where the city's African-American residents reside within the city. So Rose Hill, 10th and Page, Fifeville, Ridge Street are some of the areas of the city with the largest African-American populations. And then you also have areas like Johnson Village, Fry Spring, and Woolen Mills, which also have a high degree of African-American residents. Non-white citizens also include Hispanics. Hispanic population is concentrated in a way along the US 29 Emmett Street corridor on the north side of the city. So as we begin to think about future land use and equitability and planning, we need to make sure that we're not overly targeting underserved or underserved communities. So this was something that was quite important for us to pull out as we think about where opportunities may lie for particularly residential and access to employment and other key land use functions. Income is another demographic area that's important. This is a map of resident income. So you can see here, the lower income areas are concentrated at the university, around the university. They have a lot of college students that live in this area. And then some of the areas such as Star Hill, 10th and Page, Fifeville, Ridge Street, Woolen Mills, and these areas kind of to the east of downtown and to the west and south of downtown are where some of the lower income residents of Charlottesville live, and also along the US 29 corridor is another concentration of lower income Charlottesville residents. Transportation. To have a city, we have to have access. In this diagram, you can see some of the major corridors. The darker the blue, the more traffic is concentrated on those highways. So the 250 bypass is one of the most heavily traveled corridors in the city, along with US 29 from the north down to the south towards the university. We have 5th Street, Preston Avenue as major corridors. And then we have a series of neighborhood streets and tertiary streets that make up the city's grid. Along many of these major corridors are bus amenities. So transit is very important. And the good news is Charlottesville has a very robust transit network, which is good. And it serves as a great framework for the future land use plan, especially if we start thinking about densification. Parks and open spaces is important. Again, Charlottesville has a nice network of parks and open spaces, particularly along the river and to the north where we have large major parks. And then part of the city's urban fabric are a series of smaller neighborhood parks, which are nice. They're walkable and they serve as great community amenities. The environment is very important. This map, you can see where there are floodplains. The red and the orange areas are floodplains within the city. So you can see where you would expect for these floodplains to occur along the river and then along the stream, along Moores Creek to the south, and then Meadow Creek to the north. The city is quite topographically challenged. There's a lot of hills and valleys in the city, and you can see that this is the relief map that shows how the city's topography inundates up and down. So the city has a lot of topography which is going to be a challenge as we think about development throughout the city, and something that we have to keep in mind. The city has vacant sites. There are about 180 acres of vacant sites within the city. So from that, you can see the city is mostly built out, and many of the sites that are undeveloped have topographical challenges, or they're small sites for very small scale development opportunities. So opportunities to look for greenfield or open space development sites is quite limited in the city. And then lastly, we have public ownership. So this map begins to show where parcels are owned by the city of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, the Housing Authority, and then of course, parks and open spaces and schools. And you can see here, downtown, there's a lot of city offices, and then we have the county government center, which are major civic facilities in downtown or in the downtown area. Charlottesville has quite a few development projects that are coming up that are either planned or under construction, which is going to bring quite a few residential units and commercial square footage to the city. In fact, over 890 residential units are approved or under review for the city of Charlottesville, and 700 are under construction. So there is housing coming online. And then same with commercial, we have over 225,000 square feet of commercial development approved or under review, and 150,000 square feet under construction. And office is also one area of development that is also growing, with several 100,000 square feet of development planned or under construction.
And Ron, do you have a map showing where those are going? Because some of those numbers seem hard to believe. So it would be good to get a sense of where they're actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this information had come from the city, and yes, I think we may be able to map where some of these are. I think it would be quite interesting to see the distribution of where some of these projects are occurring, particularly the larger projects. But
Yeah.
that is information that we may have.
And how many, who are they serving? What are the, how many of those are for poor people?
Yeah. And Missy and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have detailed information about the about each unit. We do have an overall count, but I don't think we have an allocation of affordable housing for these residential developments.
Yeah, you're right. Some of them may have a profile dedication, but for the most part, it's a private development, and may or may not have affordable component to it, So,
yeah.
But maybe a handful of them might have a dedicated profile affordable unit.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question, and you might be getting to it, so my apologies if you are. For these commercial spaces, I know, for example, downtown, two things are being built. The people who work there, many of whom may be from outside the area, is there a projection for the amount of housing that those folks are going to need?
Not related to these developments. We haven't, dived into that level of detail.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other?
Yeah, I'd like to make a point. I don't think that Charlottesville has had an issue with housing being built. I think that the issue is truly around whether or not you can afford the new units that are being built. There's always been a lot of units, but are they affordable?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Any additional thoughts? We can move on to next section. Of course, if we need to circle around, we can do that later in the presentation. So we also want to recognize previous and current planning efforts as we move forward. There's been a series of existing plans and studies that have been completed in the city, ranging from citywide plans, small area plans. In fact, the Cherry Avenue small area plan was recently adopted, and other communities plans that are not small area plans, but ones that focus on neighborhood vitality. UVA does not lie in isolation, so we want to make sure that studies such as the Brandon Avenue and Ivy Corridor planning projects are recognized, and that we consider that those development projects as part of the framework of the city's future land use plans. And then the county regional plans that exist that tie the city into its context. And then we know there are a number of additional community-based plans, such as the ones being developed by the Cultivate Charlottesville organization, and other plans that address many of the city's core critical issues. So there's a lot of plans. This is an opportunity to tie those together and help to inform the future land use recommendations.
Hey, Ron, sorry I keep jumping in, but I think that you might want to also just add to the list, the plans are kind of dated now because it was 2005, but they're called the In Our Backyard plans, and it was for every single neighborhood in the city. They had each neighborhood got to develop their own plan, and I really think the city should try to emulate that effort on a regular basis, because I felt like they were really successful. They had a lot of community input, and a lot of the lists created from those plans are still quite applicable to the neighborhoods. And you know, some of those items have never been adopted even since 2005. Some of them obviously have, but it was a really cool citywide effort, and a lot of great information came out of that.
Thank you, Ashley. We will take a look at that. Any other plans or studies that anyone can think of that we might want to add to the list?
I just want to call it, Peter noted we should add the climate action plan, which is an ongoing effort, but you know, certainly we're including that in the text of the comprehensive plan, but we'll want to sort of probably recognize it on here as an ongoing effort. I think we have a raised hand from Tim as well. Maybe.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think there was a green infrastructure plan done several years ago that might be worth pulling into this. Got really good environmental data and maps. And then a question, I assume that the Star Hill Vision Plan is the work being done by the New Hill Development Corp?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And then certainly the affordable housing plan, which is certainly important and applicable to our work to develop the future land use plan. And they call for specific recommendations that we certainly want to consider, including the increase of production of multifamily housing, exploring opportunities to allow for soft density in single family residential neighborhoods. And that soft density would include some of those missing middle housing types that I went over earlier in the presentation, such as townhouses and duplexes and triplexes and other more affordable and attainable housing typologies, increasing the flexibility to permit accessory dwelling units, again, providing opportunities for lower income residents to live and thrive in the city, and including in different areas of the city, and then creating an inclusionary zoning policy to increase the production of affordable housing within the city. Any questions on that? I think we kind of asked them as we went. And I'll just move on to the future land use framework, which brings us closer to where we are today. There has been a lot of thought and thinking around what the future land use plan could be for the city. This was an analysis completed by the previous planning commission that explored opportunities to provide connections between where people live and where people work. So in this very conceptual diagram, you can see downtown is at the center of the city, the center of activity. And then this concept was exploring opportunities for these smaller, what we call nodes around the city that began to distribute opportunities for employment and housing as a concept idea based on this quarter-mile walking radius at some of these locations, which was a very interesting idea.
Hey Ron, sorry to interrupt you, but so those numbers inside the bars, are those like walk, drive, bike numbers?
They are housing from this key that was included in the plan. Those are housing and
ride numbers.
I actually remember this. Those are that's speed. I think the first is bus, the second is driving, and the third is bicycling, I think.
Or walking, maybe. Add that to the key, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Actually, the last one is bus, because it's X in many places, because there is no bus service. So yeah, it's walk, drive, bus.
And then the thinking continued into 2018, where there were more ideas being tossed around as far as what the future land use map would look like. The map you see and the key is from one iteration of the map. This map was continually updated and discussed for a while, but you can see its intent was to promote higher intensity downtown and along corridors, thinking about increase in density in some of the residential areas. And this was a plan that was meant to be a living document. And again, it was continually updated. And even more consideration was given to where density and intensity could occur throughout the city. So you can see in this map here, the purple areas are where more intensive development was recognized at that time, down to residential and the lighter shades, or lesser intensity development. So that was something that we took a look at as we developed our thoughts for the future land use plan concept. We looked to community engagement. There's been a series of community engagement events that's taken place to date. This is a summary of key themes from community engagement, particularly from the events from the spring, where areas in the pink or elements in pink are ones that directly affect future land use planning. Again, some of the themes that we heard over and over were housing affordability, racial equality, building safe, strong neighborhoods for all, land use and urban design, thinking about the form of the city, providing access through walkability, bikeability, and transit, and access to parks and open space. And again, many of the other elements also touch on land use planning, but the ones in pink were had direct correlations that began to help us develop planning objectives. And so these 8 objectives are ones that we've identified to date. And this list will refine as we hear from you tonight. And we heard a lot from the Planning Commission a few weeks ago. We're taking that information and refining these planning objectives. But to date, we have 8, one being to build upon land use recommendations integrated within the citywide studies, small area plans, and the 2021 Affordable Housing Plan. 2, want to ensure citywide equitable opportunities for density increases and enhanced community services. 3, increase density around community amenities such as shopping, employment centers, and transit. 4, explore the development potential of vacant and underutilized properties. Where are areas in the city that are ripe for development? 5, maximize access to public open spaces and schools. 6, establish synergies between the city's land uses and urban ring. 7, increase access to transit to help achieve the city's climate goals. And finally, 8, preserve and enhance the natural and cultural resources of the city.
Hey, Ron, can we have commentary on that?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Oh, I raised my hand, but it doesn't seem to be working. So I am obviously super focused on housing like everyone else, but it doesn't seem like these land use goals or objectives really talk at all about economic development. And I just wonder how how our city is gonna have a healthy tax base if we don't have any focus on economic development. So I don't want that to get lost in the conversation. I know we have certain priorities, but I'm concerned if we're not talking about that as well.
No, I think that's a great point, and something that we certainly should call out as a special planning objective.
I appreciate the point, but I'm curious what form of economic development you have in mind. That's a big world. We're not talking Amazon HQ2 here, I'm guessing.
No, I just I know that we have a housing plan, and we know that we have a lot of housing units and certain types of units that need to be built to serve our community. But I think if we're not also focused on having kind of a healthy business environment, and yeah, it's not trying to attract Amazon or build some like super stadium, but it's, we have to have that side, or the city's tax base is not going to be able to support all the housing that we want to build.
No, I think that's definitely a fair point.
I'd like to add sort of a caveat with the item number 2, because there's a lot of concern from the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition and the lower income people and Black folks that we have talked with around protecting the current majority Black neighborhoods from upzoning. So I think the density increases are a great idea in the traditionally exclusive neighborhoods or more exclusive neighborhoods, and the predominantly single family neighborhoods that are not predominantly Black. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Sunshine. I have a couple thoughts. One is on line item 6. I think it's important to call out the synergy between the city and the county. I guess one question is whether one piece that seems missing from these 8 is also the synergy between university and the planning process. So whether it gets integrated into line 6 or gets created as a separate line, I think that needs to be called out specifically.
Yeah, I think it deserves its own line, because that's a very important integration that we want to build upon. Thank you. any additional thoughts on this slide? And then we can move into the framework. If not, okay. So the future land use framework, some of you have already seen the Planning Commission presentation that was discussed on February 23rd. So the land use framework that you're going to see today is very similar to what you had seen on February 23rd. What we want to do is hear from all stakeholders. We heard from the Planning Commission. We're going to hear from you tonight, and we'll hear from others leading up to our next Planning Commission meeting. And we want to compile all the comments that we get so that we can look comprehensively at updating the framework, which will inform the draft future land use map. So if you see something that was discussed to change on at our last planning commission meeting and you see it there today, it's because we're going to update it once we hear comprehensively from stakeholders. And again, this is not the structure for the final land use map. It's the iterative process. We're going to be updating this thing as we move forward, as we hear from everyone. So there'll be opportunities to refine and update. And of course, we welcome your input and comments on any of these materials. So with that, I'll dive into the framework. And we'll take it step by step, piece by piece, starting with residential soft density opportunities, which was a major element of the affordable housing plan. What we're saying as a general framework opportunity is to explore opportunities throughout the city, not just focusing on one area. We want to make sure that we look at opportunities throughout the city, not that all housing types in the soft density realm will occur everywhere in the city, but we want to make sure that we recognize that there's a need to look in all areas of the city for opportunities of increasing residential supply. So that's why you see most of the area, all areas of the city of Charlottesville within the city limits are shaded this yellow color. Then from there, we look at the streets and connections. So we've identified corridors, and the corridors being US 29, which stretches north to south from the city's border down to UVA, Preston Avenue, which is a major corridor connecting US 29 back to the city's downtown district, McIntyre Road, which is a major corridor that connects the US 250 bypass back to the city's downtown area, West Main Street, Jefferson Park Avenue, 5th Street, and High Street. We identify those as opportunities for corridor development. And those are important because we're able to connect different areas of the city. And these are major transit corridors, so there are opportunities to build more housing and have more development along these corridors as they're close to transit, and have a relatively high degree of connectivity to the city's employment centers. So these spokes, the hub being downtown, and these corridors that lead from downtown out to the periphery of the city, which we're calling these spokes. If you think about a bicycle, the hub is in the middle, and then you have the spokes leading out to the rim of the tire. These streets will be like the spokes leading out to the rim of the city, providing opportunity for increased housing and other development opportunities. And we know that along these corridors, if we increase density along these corridors that we identify, then we want to make sure that the residential areas around them have the right amount of density. We step the density down from these corridors back to the existing neighborhoods so that we respect the tradition, the character of these existing neighborhoods as we begin to introduce new development. As part of this kind of corridor thinking. And then I spoke a little bit about the hub. So you can see now where we're making these connections. So the areas in purple are where we're thinking about, and these aren't exact locations, but the idea is that we will identify these nodes of development area that can become areas for focused development. So downtown, of course, being the city hub, and you can see those spokes that lead from downtown out to the edges, connecting downtown back to US 29, which is another focal area or node of development, taking in considerations, recommendations from the Place 29 corridor plan, which is calling for this to become more of a mixed use area along US 29. So we identify that area as an opportunity for focused development. And you can see here, it leads off the page into the county, which is already, if you remember from the urban ring plan, an area that's called for more mixed use development. So from downtown, we have the Ridge-McIntyre corridor, which there are some areas of light industrial that could be included as part of some redevelopment activity. The strategic investment area, which is already called for, and there is a master plan for that area for more density and development. And then we have these smaller circles. These are more neighborhood scale nodes where we can have some small neighborhood scale mixed use development within these neighborhoods. For example, the Cherry Avenue small area plan is calling for some mixed use development along Cherry Avenue. And when I refer to mixed use development, that is mostly talking about the integration of commercial, residential, and office uses. Potentially it could happen vertically in one building, or it can happen horizontally. So these areas are smaller, less intensive than downtown, but they offer access for and opportunities for community amenities within the neighborhood. So we have areas like Dairy Road, the Locust Road intersection, Woolen Mills, Monticello Avenue, Cherry Avenue South, where we're calling it, Cherry Avenue, as all opportunities where we're going to explore opportunities to create some type of neighborhood center for those areas to a scale that's befitting the existing residential character in those areas. So that's kind of a broad overview of where we are with the framework, thinking about, again, looking holistically throughout the city for areas for more residential uses, including those soft density opportunities, the corridors, which builds upon areas of the city that may have underutilized properties, such as US 29, where we have a lot of commercial development along the corridor that can be ripe for redevelopment. And then our nodes, which are areas that create neighborhood place and become a center for neighborhoods and residential areas, and then building into where areas that have existing employment hubs, such as the downtown and other areas that already have master plans. And then I don't think I mentioned UVA. UVA is another special area. It is an area of activity. There's a lot of development potential around it. So that's another focal area that we identified on the plan. So these circles are not exact. I mean, these neighborhood nodes could be very small, but they are just to signify areas that we want to look closely at as we develop the draft of the plan, areas that we want to just look closely
Charlottesville steering committee for the comp plan.
So with that, I think I talked enough through the framework. I want to open it up for any questions or discussion on the general thinking that makes up the framework for what we've developed to date.
And I just want to note, thank you, Ron. Grab some water, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Blah, blah, blah.
But so as we noted early on, this is really a similar map to what we showed the Planning Commission, and we have been thinking about various potential changes to this, but we wanted to get your reactions to this sort of version of it. We did make
Yeah.
some small tweaks for clarification, but we're thinking about things like, should there be different scales of nodes and different scales of corridors, throughout the city? We're looking at potential additional corridors or nodes or changes. So any ideas you have about those are more than welcome. So the two, we on the agenda, we had a few questions, and we've already addressed the land use planning objectives, but in general, we're wondering if you think this framework sort of makes sense given the objectives that we outlined and the discussion we've had, throughout this whole process, and then whether there are other corridors or nodes that you think we should be showing. So we'll open it up for general discussion. I think maybe if we use just to keep things orderly, maybe use the raise your hand button just to make sure everyone gets a chance. But yeah, happy to hear your thoughts. So maybe we can start with, I think Ashley, I saw your hand first.
Okay, sorry, I've been talking a lot tonight, but I like this as a general framework. I think a couple of comments is just, I'm trying to imagine, given that Charlottesville does really utilize their comprehensive plan and land use plan when they are looking at development proposals. I guess I'm trying to think of this on the other, once we actually get something adopted, how one might successfully utilize a land use plan, because I do like having something that's not totally property specific. I think our old land use plan was very much like just copying the zoning map, or kind of another version of the zoning map. So I like this idea of thinking about where nodes of activity might be and how maybe you step down from nodes, like maybe having a different size node or different demarcation. But I do think we need to think about, for the sake of staff and future applicants, how we'll actually be able to utilize the land use plan and what we want to do with that. Smaller comment is just Locust Avenue, not Locust Road. And just, looking a little bit more specifically, and I know the Planning Commission brought up some of this information, like how that Belmont node might stretch a little bit and connect more into that Broadway, Woolen Mills area, because there are kind of commercial properties in between there that might change along the way. And I guess I imagine, like, for the Locust Avenue Gateway and the Dairy Gateway, like it might be interesting, and I would probably have a lot of people mad at me, but I kind of think more of those neighborhood places not along the really busy highway type corridor. Like, they might be a little bit more tucked into the neighborhood, more like you see the downtown Belmont one. And I don't know how you would successfully, strategically kind of insert that into an existing neighborhood. That's probably extremely controversial, but I think I love those types of places, but I think they're potentially more enjoyable if they're not right along a corridor like US 250. So if you're thinking of more like the neighborhood convenience store and coffee shop, I don't know if that's how you're imagining them. And I know they might all each have their own character, but those are some general ideas.
Yes, thank you. And the two nodes along 250 were placed because if we want to try to attract some commercial type activity, particularly for mixed use development, we were thinking in these particular areas that there was an opportunity because of the visibility, and these are termini at some not major streets, but some fairly important neighborhood streets, such as Locust Avenue and Dairy Road. But we can certainly, we look at this, explore opportunities, not just to be right at that area of intense traffic at the ramps, but perhaps pull it back some, and maybe it becomes a partial neighborhood. We have been exploring that idea of, these major urban corridors being one type of corridor, but maybe there's a second type where they're more neighborhood oriented, where they have the same characteristics that we're imagining for these neighborhood nodes, but maybe they become more linear and away from these intersections, so that we can, like you're saying, get that more community feel and walkability without all the traffic of being right next to a ramp. So that's something.
Yeah, you might want to think about them maybe paired with a different type of community amenity. Like you have the high school site that's not far from Dairy Road, or there's like Northeast Park in my neighborhood. It might just be a different way to think about it.
Yeah, I think Lyle, at the Planning Commission meeting, I believe it was you that brought up looking at sort of proximity to parks and schools. So that's something we've been thinking about. So we appreciate, I think, that note from you too, Ashley. And I want to make sure we don't skip over the first part of your question, which was sort of how could this be applied by the Planning Commission, which, so I just want to make sure it's clear. We wanted to start by using this high level framework because we didn't want to come at you with a really specific map, because then everyone gets kind of lost in the weeds, and we want to make sure we could talk more about at a high level this overall strategy. But we are working on, we will have the next time we meet with the Planning Commission on the 30th, actually March 30th, is a work session. We will have a more specific sort of land use map that will make it more clear how this would be applied, you know, on a sort of parcel based.
Yeah.
Let's see, Diane, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm sorry that I had to log in late. I got caught up in something, and so this may have been addressed. But the first comment is there a pedestrian or as you just said, walkability, a pedestrian access overlay to this that would refine some of these considerations of nodes and gateways and major passageways? So for instance, High Street currently can be very challenging for school children to cross on their way to Burnley Moran. And so the heightened development of High Street without a serious consideration of pedestrian issues would be a real miss. Kids live all the way down towards Woolen, not quite to Woolen. I'm not sure how far they walk, but they're crossing High Street from like the neighborhood that's got Woolen Mills right across it. Again, I'm not quite sure where the Clark line is, but there's kids who are, and it's a big deal where parents are driving their kids a quarter of a mile to school because they can't cross the street. And that happens all the way up High Street, the little high neighborhood that's crossing over High Street into the Burnley Moran neighborhood. So I think that I'm sure that others can point out pedestrian issues throughout the city. And it's I know that the my neighborhood association has been pre-COVID, I should say. We were developing plans with North Main and with whatever the neighborhood is below, maybe it's called Woolen Mills, to look at collaboration on pedestrian concerns. And it really is, it's pedestrian in general, but the real challenge is the desire for children to be able to walk to school. They can't cross Locust as is in the morning or evening, and they cannot cross High Street. So you've got, again, people driving their kids in the morning and evening a couple blocks to avoid the traffic challenge. The second comment is also on the Locust Road gateway area. And as already was mentioned, there's ramps. There's not just ramps, there's that concrete bridge, which is a major traffic problem and accident problem. One of our neighbors is actually, he's taken on his civic duty to count how many accidents happen there on a regular basis. It's a very challenging, narrow pass, and there's no, that I know of, and if you've got, with the transportation planning, any improvements. So it's the ramps. It's a very narrow bridge crossing that is already a safety and traffic problem. And so I agree that the idea of, rather than putting I don't question the node. I think these are interesting, but you're not going to gather people on the corners of 250, but you might gather them a couple blocks up. Where Locust, the cross street, a couple blocks north, which is another major cross street that people take to then go down and join up with Park Street, the alternative crossing over to the Parkway. So I think that I would share the concerns about the nodes being the hotspots of what is transportation hotspots already.
No, I think that's, and one a plan that we're cross-referencing as we refine corridors and nodes is the city streets that work plan, which identifies some areas of transportation. So we are looking at that as we continue through, and as part of the land use recommendations and urban form recommendations, we will talk about creating more pedestrian friendly environments along these corridors, you know, thinking about these as more of urban boulevards that are that do have safe pedestrian facilities and transit facilities, and making them great urban streets that will be more amenable to accepting these higher density recommendations.
Good luck with that. Because right now, Locust is a major, as I'm sure you know, is a major, particularly outbound in the evening. It's very fast speed. It's a 25-mile-an-hour road, and people are clocked at 45, and then they jam on their brakes when they hit the bridge.
Another area that was discussed at the Planning Commission was Park Road.
Yeah, Park Street.
As an alternative. So that's something that we've been looking at too.
Yeah, well, that of course has had has had the street improvements to slow traffic down, and it's still it's Locust and Park are northbound, the northern outbound routes every evening to 250.
Okay.
As is High Street. But again, I really would urge the using pedestrian considerations as a refinement of the locations of these nodes, because I think that it's immensely popular with the residents. The pedestrian ability issue is something that comes up all the time, and it's desirable for climate planning, whatever pick a concern. Pedestrian ability would be an enhancement on just about any economic development.
Yeah.
So I really.
Sorry, yeah. I think that needs to be a key element of any, if we're identifying corridors, making sure that, whether we call it pedestrian ability or, just general sort of walkability, bikeability, I think these can be focus areas for improvements. And so, we don't want to focus just on where there's currently good, infrastructure, but we want to make sure there's the opportunity to improve current infrastructure. We know some places have really, difficult to work with topography, for example, that would really make it difficult to make it easy to walk. So that's all things that we are keeping in mind as we refine this. But thank you, Diane.
Yeah, thank you.
Carl, I think you might be next.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna say maybe a little bit of a different spin on what Diane and Ashley have said, speaking about the nodes. I mean, I appreciate the idea that it's good to pick a spot where there might be a little more intense development, but it seems like for walkability, what we really want are little micro nodes scattered throughout the whole city. Historically, neighborhoods had these, in 10th and Page, there's a number of businesses. Some of them have been converted into homes. Some of them still exist. You go up Avon and there's a corner store, corner grocery every once in a while. You go down Rosehill Drive and there's a little cluster of shops. And these all make little neighborhood centers for the surrounding couple of blocks. So I'm wondering if, you know, we've got a small lot SUP option in the city, but it's only available for, you know, the core of the city. It's not available throughout all of the city. And I'm wondering if that needs to be expanded, and maybe the idea of nodes should be looking at, you know, are there any places that it's not appropriate to have a node? And I'm not sure there are, but it almost, my point of view, I'd rather see lots of little micro nodes that you could walk to that are 2 blocks away versus, you know, like having the one point on Locust. Doesn't really serve the whole neighborhood. It would be better if there's a corner store maybe every 3 blocks or something. So to kind of allow that sort of flexibility to allow mixed use throughout the entire city, but maybe with a special use permit that allows some control, so it's not, you know, you don't end up with a Walmart in the middle of someone's neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. You know, this nodes idea is sort of built on the previous planning commission process, but I think, and planning commissioners, feel free to clarify or jump in. But yeah, I think you all had sort of a different take on it as well, and did have some sort of flexible boundaries. Sunshine, I'm seeing noted potential for looking at different sort of node scaling, different sizes of nodes, and that's certainly something that we're looking at with this as we move forward. But that would still be identifying, you know, locations for nodes instead of sort of opening it up. But.
Yeah, letting it happen organically, as it would traditionally in the traditional city environment in the past. Which I think is a really interesting idea.
So that's something we can think about. I think, you know, I heard what you said about maybe identifying areas where it wouldn't be appropriate to have a node. And like you said, you know, we'd have to think through what that would look like. But we can do some thinking on this. Or if anyone else has thoughts on that, I actually sort of liked that idea. If there's other thoughts on that concept, we're happy to discuss.
I can say just remembering the planning commission stuff, and Jody can maybe jump in if I'm vague. But we talked about scale a lot with the node idea. We also talked about an idea of sort of neighborhood centers that could sort of come up at neighborhood initiative, which I thought was very interesting.
Well, let's see. We can elaborate on that more if anyone else has thoughts on that concept. But I'm gonna suggest maybe Peter, if you want to share your comments.
Yeah, thank you. I have a 1A and a 1B and then a 2. So I think you've said this, but I want to be sort of explicit that when we're doing this, the corridors there should be implications for something being a corridor, and they should have certain characteristics like that walkability. By High Street being named a corridor, then there are people there and it needs to be walkable. And so getting across it needs to be fixed. That's just what we have to do. Also, there are different types of corridors, and I might add at least 2 more to your map. One is that 250, the bypass, is definitely a corridor, right? But it's not one that has businesses along it. It's one that has parks along it. It's got the high school, it's got the Y. So thinking about the Dairy Street Gateway, that's not a corner that should have a shopping center, but that might be a corner where people come together. And it strings along a nice rope of pearls between Barracks and 29, as well as the high school, the Y, the park, skate park, you know, McIntyre Road, etc. Perhaps all the way to Freebridge. Another interesting corridor is actually the Carlton Avenue corridor. This is not a commuter route, but it's again another string of resources that goes all the way from really the Belmont Bridge all the way to the Woolen Mills project. And that sort of gets to, I think, what Ashley was talking about. And if you visit it, it is that. It is like a string of places that is a mile long, therefore a corridor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was point number one. Point number two, let me know if we're gonna have this conversation another time, but and here I'm speaking as citizen Peter Krebs, PC. We simply haven't done the analysis for this yet, but was there, is this process going to result in a decision that the soft density is a citywide phenomenon, or if it's something that should be in the toolbox that could be brought forth in certain places? I think this is a super important thing to work through. And I personally would not want to have a scenario where certain neighborhoods got to say, oh, we want to have ADUs, but we can't have duplexes. I think if we as a community are going to decide that soft density is okay for our community, then it's something that's okay for our community, not something that certain people got to slam the gate to. That's just my own opinion.
So to address that, so the way we are thinking about it right now is that in the comprehensive plan, the future land use map, there will likely be a base of general soft density that would be sort of a range of everything from thinking about how it's described in the affordable housing plan. It talks about soft density, everything from sort of ADUs up to sort of quadplex, that type of thing. And so in the future land use framework, we're planning to right now have, like I said, this sort of base of soft density. And then the zoning piece may look at based on different characteristics such as topography, as I mentioned before, parcel sizes, other, potentially sort of overlay districts that exist now, different things that might inhibit what can be done on a property, might look at different ways to tailor what soft density looks like in a neighborhood or on a parcel, and again, in that zoning phase. And we know there has, I know there's been concerns mentioned tonight about sort of historically Black neighborhoods or other neighborhoods where, we might want to discuss whether certain levels of change would be appropriate or not, just as an example. So like I said, so just to one more time explicitly answer your question, our plan right now, and Ron, please correct me if I'm wrong, is to, in the future land use map, we'll show it more broadly applied across the city. And then the zoning will look at and we'll discuss what that means in the text. And then the zoning will look more explicitly at specific neighborhoods or parcels.
That's right.
A long answer to your question. Okay.
Thank you. Let me
Sure.
lower my hand.
Let's see. Carl, did you have another question or is your... Okay. Let's see. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but there are some people we haven't heard from too much on today. I won't call out any names, but if anyone does, I want to share your thoughts. I'd really welcome you to raise your hand or just unmute now and let us know, or you can always share it via chat as well. I know not everyone's super comfortable speaking up on a call.
I just want to make sure that at this point and going forward, that when we make these decisions, we are mindful of how leadership after us or in the future will interpret this. And we don't leave too much leeway where they can undo all the things that we intended to do.
I think that's a great point. For example, with the soft density, for example, in the land use map, we'll want to be really explicit about, the intent of this is to give a base framework that can be applied through the zoning in such and such way, and be more clear about, this how it ties to the affordable housing plan and whatnot. That's just one example, but I think and that will go into detail also in terms of the different types of corridors, the different type of nodes, what we're envisioning in there, and how it addresses, how it should address, these different objectives, including things like walkability, for example, that came up tonight. What should be a requirement along these corridors? So I agree with you, Ms. Hernan, and I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, as we go. We don't want to lose anything that we've talked about. Other thoughts on anything we've talked about tonight? Got a lot of good feedback already.
I'd just like to wear the food justice hat since Jeanette hasn't spoken, and I think it's worth talking about.
Yes.
The one item that was discussed a lot in the 2018 process was, as part of Complete Places, was neighborhood grocery stores. That's something we have in a few places in Charlottesville, but it's pretty scarce these days. That, looking back, very valuable. Looking forward, hope it comes back. Would like to see that.
Yeah, and we have been, and I'll let Jeanette speak up if she would like to, but I did meet with Cultivate folks the other day as we're getting Jeanette up to speed as a new member of the steering committee. And we talked about the work that's been done previously and how that might be incorporated into the chapters, the sort of goals and strategies in the document, the comp plan. But I think as we look to that next iteration of the land use map where we get more specific, I think what we might want to think about when we're talking about these different areas, what might be in them, and that could tie closely to some of those goals. So,
yeah. I guess.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Lyle, for bringing that up. I'm not exactly sure where all of the comments fit. One thing I do think, and I've mentioned this to Jenny, is that like the overall land use framework, it would be really helpful to include a lens for urban agriculture, as well as for the economic development in terms of grocery store pieces. So, and I think you mentioned, Jenny, that kind of fits in another chapter. But I think as we look at many of these maps, we were going to try and find the maps that we've done in the past that looked at the various community gardens or urban farms and share that with the planning team so that they could integrate it into the proposal.
Yeah, someone mentioned green print earlier as well, and that is a plan that we have and we know has been completed, and so that'll be another sort of refinement on top of this as we go. Not exactly, sort of tied in the same way of looking at open space and whatnot.
I'm not sure if this has already been said, but I think it's important to look at healthy food options because we do have some pretty significant food deserts. And I love what Jeanette was saying, but I also think if we're talking about stores, we should be looking at models that probably need some subsidy, like becoming a program of some nonprofit entity in order to make sure there's healthy food available.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We see that as really tied to the affordable housing piece as well, that any affordable housing model could and should include an analysis of food access, affordable, healthy food access within where that is centered as well.
That's a great point, because maybe it doesn't need to be a really expensive citywide solution so much as looking at where the food deserts are now, where housing is affordable and lower income people live.
And also that again, it's getting into what we mean when we think about economic development, right? I mean, having healthy people, enterprises that are serving people trying to do the right thing, like that needs to be part of the strategy.
Yep. And, I saw that comment you made in the chat earlier, Peter, about sort of thinking about economic development. And so there is, there's an economic, I believe it's called economic sustainability chapter in the plan. But I think the comments that we heard tonight about thinking about that in terms of land use and, leaving opportunities for economic development as part of the land use framework, I think that's a good comment. And these things shouldn't live in a stovepipe. It shouldn't only be addressed in the economic sustainability chapter. So I think you're right to think that we need to pull that in here as well.
Well, and I just kind of building on that, like just making sure that we're linking the data on, here's the housing that we need, or here's what we learned from the housing plan, and here's, I don't know what exactly the economic development chapter says, but just making sure that that's really tied to the land use. And we're thinking like it's a tough puzzle in Charlottesville since we are pretty built out, but thinking about what it is we need to fit in there. And I also just wanted to, I'm not really sure how it works in the land use plan, but just starting to think about, I love that idea of a toolkit. And we know that right now in Charlottesville, we have a lot of tools that maybe don't work very well, like the infill SUP doesn't work. The typical SUP has a lot of issues. So just, I think we welcome your ideas on like what other communities are doing successfully to make that process better all around, and like really figuring out what we want and how to get it. So that process is a little bit less painful in the future.
Got it. Thank you. Well, let's see. Seeing no other hands raised and noting that we wanted to save some time for any input from other attendees tonight, I might suggest that we briefly go to the next steps, just so we skip right over discussion since we've done that without a slide. And so just some thoughts, and then if you all have other follow-up questions, we're happy to talk about that too. But so just as we look moving forward here, we're looking right now at, we're finishing up our revisions or initial revisions to goals and strategies throughout the plan. These will be constantly changing, I'm sure, and there will be additional input from staff and from the community in general. We are planning to offer steering committee members, you all, a chance to take a look at those chapters prior to the full community review, and I'll follow up with more information about that by email. We know that you all bring a lot of different expertise, but we can't, we don't think anyone probably wants to sit in a meeting and talk through the text of the chapters explicitly. So that's why we didn't suggest doing that. But we know you bring expertise that can really make those chapters stronger. So we'll welcome your thoughts on those. And again, I'll follow up with you via email. But I wanted to briefly note, just talk about some of our thoughts about next steps for community engagement. So again, we're hoping that can get started by mid-April, and that would be sort of have a focus on speaking with the general Charlottesville community about this future land use map, whatever that next iteration of it looks like. We'll also have a chance for people to weigh in on the different chapters and the strategies in those chapters and whatnot, and how implementation might look with those. But our focus on sort of with general community members is we'll want to share with people what the future land use map says and how it is potentially changing what's in there now, excuse me. Just having conversations about how this addresses goals we've established, both in terms of general community equity and the different land use objectives that we have outlined, or that we will sort of refine. So we're figuring out how those discussions will look as we get to April. Obviously, we will have virtual engagement, but we're hoping by that point we can do some of those activities we envisioned originally, which is more out in neighborhoods, small COVID-safe in-person activities to get input that can pair well with any online engagement, whether it's a mapping activity or other activities to get input and share information. So that all being said, we are working on refining the strategy now. Obviously, some of it is going to be refined as we learn more about the situation with COVID in the next few weeks to see how things are going. But we will certainly let you all know once we've got more specific strategy with that. LaToya, did you want to add anything about engagement moving forward?
And I think you covered covered everything. You know, we're obviously adapting our approach, you know, as we go through this process together. But we, you know, as before, we want to make sure that we get as much public involvement as possible and from as many diverse sets of voices as possible as well. So you know, the process is certainly not over. So we're going to continue to try to push this next phase out and get as much feedback as we can from as many people as possible.
So any questions about any of that or next steps?
I guess just mechanically, we have found it very difficult to get in contact with low-income renters, renters of color. It's just harder to get to them. They're busy. Is that more realistic now?
You mean in terms of if we, if maybe COVID is less of a concern? That's our hope, is that by going out into communities, you know, having a presence on the ground, that we can hope more than we have. We've been doing that periodically, but being able to be a bit more, you know, advertising it a bit more widely, because it's okay if a few more people are there, trying to, you know, make sure people know ahead of time where we'll be, so we can spread the word about that. You know, we're hoping that that'll be a possibility, because I think that will help us to, you know, engage with folks, both in terms of people who plan to come and meet up with us, or people who are just sort of walking by and see us.
Yeah, and I'll also just add, it's been a challenge. I mean, just throughout all of COVID, and not just in Charlottesville. I mean, those folks in the line know that I do engagement elsewhere. It's been reaching low-income communities is a continued challenge because of the sometimes limited abilities to get onto technology like this. And so the inability to do in person has certainly hindered a lot of traditional outreach efforts. So as Jenny said, we're certainly hoping that with the warmer weather, and then obviously watching what's happening with COVID and vaccinations, we'll be able to have a bit more luck with some of those residents that are a bit harder to reach.
That's really important. I am glad you brought that up, Lyle, because the demographics of the people who participated really didn't reflect the people who are most directly affected by these issues. So I don't know if it would help to brainstorm some ideas, but I do think that flyering isn't enough, that it really needs to be that one-to-one approach with a survey document or whatever you can do to engage people directly and help them understand what's being discussed, because these issues are so they're so esoteric and complicated, and people don't even realize that this will determine where you and your family and your neighbors live and where your kids will live. You know, that it really needs to be made real to folks as much as it possibly can, so that we can get input from the people who are most directly affected by the shortage of affordable housing.
Yeah. I to your point, I think it would be good for us to consider having a brainstorm session. Many of you are doing, you know, engaging with communities that we're talking about daily, and you probably have, I mean, we've talked with many of you throughout, but you might, you know, you're learning as you go as well with the situation now. So Latoya, maybe we can find some time to do that. Would be great.
Sure, absolutely. And again, I'll also mention, you know, as we continue to move forward, we're going to be as creative as possible, but we're also going to continue to be as safe as possible. So I do want to reiterate that fact as well. We are going to do as much as we can, as safely as we possibly can, to reach out to as many people, particularly those harder to reach folks. But I do want to emphasize also that we're going to be safe while we do it. And so that does mean being strategic about how we do in-person activities.
Yeah, and that includes, we have a few peer engagers we've been working with, but that's, you know, we haven't, you know, we've been using them in ways that keeps them safe as well. So hopefully we'll have another chance for, in this next phase, for them to help us get the word out and have some of those more one-on-one conversations with folks. All right, let's see here. So I'm not seeing any other hands from the steering committee, so I'll suggest that we allow some time to hear from others who are in attendance tonight. So if you are an attendee, let's see, Latoya, should they be able to raise their hand at this point if they want to speak?
Yeah, they can definitely raise their hand.
Okay, so if you are an attendee who's not on the steering committee and you'd like to make a comment, you can either type it in the Q&A box or feel free to raise your hand and we can bring you off of mute. There's one question here. I believe this individual might not be on the call anymore, so I'm sorry we didn't get to this before you left, but there's a question going back to that slide that had the list of sort of development that's in process right now. It had sort of the square footage for commercial and the number of units for residential, just to remind everyone. There's a question about, out of the 890 plus residential areas approved or under review, how many include the missing middle? And Missy or Alex, I don't know if you can speak to this or not based on that the data we were using to make that that slide, but my guess is, I know we talked about the fact that we don't have information about the affordability level of those units, and I don't know that we have.
Yeah, we don't have that. The information you have is based on the permit process. You know, however, those that have profiled units, you know, have affordable units, and the rest of them that doesn't, those are private development. And I just want to clarify something. You really can't force a developer if it's not required through a proper process to dedicate affordable housing, unless that developer is one that specializes in development of affordable housing, 1, 2, or that developer is willing, you know, to dedicate affordable housing for those that have low or moderate income, you know. So that's how you get those folks to build affordable housing for low income people. Like I said, we can provide a list, the list of the project. We can provide that, but right now we can't do any mapping because we're in the process of hiring a GIS replacement, you know, right now, you know. So that's how those residential units are developed. I just want to caution people, you know, because sometimes we tend to get carried away. We talk about affordable housing. You cannot mandate a private developer to develop affordable housing if you don't have subsidy in that project. You can't do that, you know. So I just want to have everybody keep that in mind. You know, if a developer decides to develop affordable housing by his own free will, you know, without any, he can do it, you know. However, it's pretty difficult for developers, you know, to when they look at their bottom line, to use their money to invest in affordable housing development, unless there is enough subsidy for them to make a profit.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
So.
Well, as far as questions from other attendees go, I don't see any hands raised, and I don't think any other questions have come in the Q&A. Ron, can you go to the last slide with the contact info on it, just so we have it up for anyone who is in attendance who might not know how to get a hold of us? This is how you can do it. But I guess in the meantime, let's see. Lyle, did you want to mention what you wrote in the chat box, or was that more of just a note?
I can say it briefly. It's a planning commission sort of conversation that I'm bringing back from the land of 2018. Issues we have unresolved in the planning commission, in my view. Industrial uses, are we still going to do them? How can we be efficient and equitable if we are still doing industrial? The river, what do we do? Is it just parks? Is it going to be high density mixed use? Something in between? A lot of that right now is zoned single family detached. That's probably going away. So what?
Well, there is a current river plan happening, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that we're sort of keeping in mind. you know, it's shown on the different plans that are taking place right now. And we have identified one potential node, I believe, along the river, but so TBD, I guess, on the river, but I think it is such a community resource, a valuable resource for the community that we, you're right to put an emphasis on it and make sure that we keep that in mind. In terms of the industrial uses, again, that's something that, you know, we need to identify. Are you talking in terms of suggesting redevelopment of industrial uses? You know, would that be equitable? Or are you saying potential growth areas near industrial uses?
So historically, we pretty much developed low-income housing in industrial areas because that's where it's
I understand.
permitted.
Okay.
And not necessarily out of an equity focus, just practicality. That's where it could be done, which has led to a scarcity of industrial uses in the city. And there's a real tension there because those industrial uses allow for blue-collar, you know, career ladder jobs that are actually really important. I don't have answers. I've just got problems.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying the problem at hand to keep in mind as we go forward. Let's see here. Let's see. We do have someone who's working on a question. I see that. So we'll hang up for a second. I guess I'll open it back up one more time. Oh, okay, we've got a question. Okay. Let's see. This, and I need to ask for guidance here. We have a question from a planning commissioner. Since there are 2 planning commissioners on the call, is it okay that I read this question? Can anyone confirm this for me?
Look at it, Alex.
Alex, we have a comment or question from Liz Russell. And
wasn't this a publicly announced meeting?
What is the question?
Yes, I'm just trying to make sure there's not an issue of having more than 2 planning commissioners.
I think it's okay just to read the question, but as long as she's not engaging in the dialogue. Sorry, I'm just Heather weighing in.
Great. Thank you for clarifying. It's more of a comment, as she noted.
Okay.
Let's see here. The comments. Oops. Thank you for the conversation and explanation around soft density and how it relates to the future land use map versus how it will be addressed in the actual zoning work. She wants to offer that existing zoning might actually protect some naturally occurring affordable housing, which might also be the older housing in neighborhoods like 10th and Page, Rose Hill, etc., and might also protect against speculative demolition for high-end development. She noted that land values will rise with upzoning, incentivizing the demolition of smaller, older housing stock in favor of luxury housing. Indiscriminate upzoning or even soft density might have the opposite effect of increasing affordability if not coupled with demolition disincentives or affordability requirements. She encourages the consultants to consider strategies to encourage the creation of new housing units without demolishing what exists, which could be done through ADUs or remodeling to create multiple units, though perhaps requiring a zoning change. So a comment that is, we've discussed sort of with Planning Commission and whatnot as well, things that we are keeping in mind. So thank you for that. Well, it is just about 5:30. We're ahead of schedule for the first time in a steering committee meeting. So I will, thank you all again for coming tonight. I'm glad we have such a big group. I know it's been a while since we've talked. So, please, keep an eye out for more information from me as far as next step goes. But if there are no other questions, I think we can go ahead and adjourn. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.